We go. Hi, it's Newsmakers, and this is Hap Freund, not Jerry Roberts. We have no Jerry today. I'm Jerry's mostly silent partner on Newsmakers, but today I have the honor of interviewing my longtime friend and former colleague, Roger Goldman. Roger is one of the experts in the whole country on police licensing and decertification. We're going to talk about what's happening in 45 of the 50 states, why California doesn't have decertification, and what's happening at the national level in Congress. And Roger, why don't you start with how you got involved with this, because it's such an interesting story.
Well, Hap, this was many, many years ago in the late 70s when a couple of reporters for the Post-Dispatch were following a department that was pretty much out of control. There was a lieutenant there.
This was in St. Louis. This was in St. Louis.
St. Louis County, a small department called Maplewood. And a lieutenant there named Joseph Sorbello would, among other things, to get confessions, stick a gun down a suspect's throat and say, suck on it. But even worse, he would play Russian roulette. And apparently some of the patrolmen under him thought this was a good way to get a confession. So not in his presence, these two patrolmen handcuffed a mentally challenged individual suspected of trying to cash an $80 stolen cashier's check, pulled the trigger, and killed Tom Brown. That's just the beginning of the story, because it turns out that despite what this fellow Sorbello had done in his treatment of using Russian roulette, he's fired and goes to an even smaller department out in St. Louis County near the airport called Bridgeton Terrace. The police chief, having read the Post-Dispatch articles about what was going on at Maplewood, nonetheless hired him. And part-time, he goes back to Maplewood, where he's now working full-time at a clothing store, sees someone sitting in his car, assumes he's going to steal it, tells him he's a cop, get out of the car, he shoots him in the back and kills him. So basically responsible for a couple of deaths. Never prosecuted because the fellow was dead, and so he was never criminally prosecuted. But that's when I could not believe that we could allow someone who, with that background of training people in Russian roulette, could stay in policing. I got a grant from the university, St. Louis University, and studied how other states deal with this so-called wandering officer, rogue officer, a lot of names used for it, and wrote several articles on it, and got a law passed in Missouri that for the first time had decertification, that is, removing the license of an officer like Sorbello. And since that time, I have been, in the last 40 years, working in other states to get them to pass laws, or states that have the laws to get them to strengthen them.
It's great. And then, well, not great what happened, but great what you've done. And I know you've worked at this because we've talked about it a lot for 40 years. Now, that was a case of them knowingly hiring someone who really shouldn't have been an officer. And then you were mentioning to me earlier when we were talking about Tamir Rice, her situation. How is that different for the officers?
Now, it was a young 14-year-old boy in Cleveland who was killed. I was holding a toy gun and pointing him at an officer named Timothy Lohman, who had resigned from Independence, Ohio. And in his police file at Independence, he'd resigned, and the deputy chief had written in that file, this fellow should never be hired. Among other things, he wept on the firing range during training. So you can imagine if he sees somebody pointing a toy gun or any kind of gun at him, what he's going to do. So that's the second example where Cleveland never checked. So the answer to the question, how do we get these rogue officers doing something terrible at one department going to another? The first instance, Sorbello, they knowingly hired him, typically because these are smaller departments who can't afford to get a good officer. So they'll take whoever they can get.
You want somebody who's already trained
already trained, and therefore the department wouldn't have to pay for the training or his salary during training. So it's very tempting to do that. And then the second situation, like in the Cleveland case, where they just never checked.
Why would they never check?
Well, it's hard to believe that they never checked. It turns out that a couple of states, they just leave it up to the local departments. And of course, it cost them a $6 million settlement afterwards. So in hindsight, they wish they checked. Yeah. But one of the things I've been advocating, a couple of states are now doing it, You wouldn't think it was necessary, but many state laws, post or Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission that do the decertification are now requiring departments to check with prior departments. Those prior departments must respond, and if they respond in good faith, they're immune from suit. So that's a trend that you'd think would be obvious, but it's needed in every state.
So now we have there are 45 states, as I understand it, that have some kind of licensing and decertification provisions.
Absolutely right. 45 states. When I began, there were 15 many years ago, and now we're up to 45. And the 5 states that don't do it, California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, all very blue progressive states. So your listeners might be surprised that those are the 5 states that don't have it. But the good news is every one of those states, including California just this week, except for Rhode Island, have introduced a bill, including California, to now start to decertify.
So this is really part of the George Floyd legacy, I was guessing.
Absolutely. Part of the George Floyd legacy. There's no doubt about it. It takes a terrible thing, just like that Sorbello case, to get that law passed in Missouri. And it took George Floyd to get, it looks like, every other state at least going in the right direction.
So the 45 states have legislation now. Minnesota is one of those, and yet this police officer, Chauvin, is that how you pronounce his name? Derek Chauvin. So he had like 16 or 17 complaints in his record, right?
Correct. So this gets to the point, Hap, that there's tremendous variation among the states. So just because you, quote, have a law on decertification, the devil's in the details. And the main distinction between states that have strong and effective laws, Georgia and Florida have decertified, the last check that was done nationally in 2015, 40% of all the decertifications. I don't believe for a minute that their cops are any better or any worse than any place in the country, but they do not limit their decertifications just to a criminal conviction. That's the rule in about a third of the decertifying states. And we wouldn't do this for any other profession. A lawyer, a doctor, a barber, a cosmetologist doesn't have to be criminally convicted before we can move that person's license. And so the better laws in the California proposal would say commission of the misconduct, not just the conviction, criminal conviction, can lead to decertification. And Minnesota is one of those states with a weak law, and for whatever reason, this guy Chauvin, even with those complaints, we don't know if those complaints rose to a decertifiable offense. Just because you've done something wrong doesn't necessarily, before, we're not exactly sure what they were, necessarily would lead to decertification.
So I guess what I want to know is if in the cases where in the cases where someone has committed some kind of offense, I mean, how do you protect the policeman from, I mean, what's their due process and what's their right to privacy? What if they're charged with something, but they're not convicted, or they're charged and they're not a finding? How do you also guard the policeman's?
Right. So it's the same question you would ask for any other professional licensing organization in your state: teachers, lawyers, doctors. There's a due process hearing by the state board. Again, they're called Peace Officer Standards and Training Commissions. In a lot of states, they're called Criminal Justice and Standards and Training. Those are states that do more than just decertify law enforcement officers. But there's a fair hearing. Witnesses appointed, to test. You can cross-examine, have a lawyer, and so it's just we have for every other profession. My view is we need this for police, just like we have it for a multitude of professions in the state of California.
And then, so the kinds of misbehavior, let's call it, that should be covered in your sense. I mean, I have a note here: misdemeanors, racist statements on Facebook, internal discipline that doesn't rise to a criminal offense, allegations of sexual misconduct. Those are the kinds of things that should be grounds for
right. Excessive force. Another very important one is perjury. If you lie on police reports or give false testimony, you definitely don't want that person to stay, and have wrongful convictions. And the real question is,
that would jeopardize all of the convictions that person probably testified on.
Absolutely right. So what you would want would be, and by the way, I would not say all misdemeanors, convictions of misdemeanors, because some could be, you might have a misdemeanor 5 years ago for possessing marijuana. It's no longer even a crime. So you have to be careful on that. Plus, if you have misdemeanor convictions, it may have run into court of ban the box problems that you'd be keeping diverse people because of the unequal treatment in
Yeah.
prosecutions. So bottom line is you really have to be careful when you draft the statute. If it's too narrow, you're going to have people slip through the cracks. So there is a temptation in some states to try to govern. I'll give you a situation in Missouri. There were several officers working in Webster Groves, Missouri Police Department who were fired for having sex with teenage girls in hot tubs on duty. And they were decertified. They then were hired by other departments, surprisingly, who knew about it. And they were finally decertified under a statute that's now been narrowed, but it said gross misconduct indicating an inability to be a peace officer. Now that's very broad, but the problem for legislators is how do you draft it that it's not so narrow? It turns out having sex with minors, teenagers, they were teenagers, but they weren't minors. How do you make sure you can do that? So the drafting is really, really important.
So what states have the best legislation, and what makes their legislation better?
Well, so as I say, the states that have the most number of decertifications, Georgia and Florida by far. Interestingly, Georgia and Florida both decertify corrections officers. We've been focused on law enforcement, and they decertified the last study 3 times the number of corrections officers compared to law enforcement officers.
And a correction officer, you should explain what that is too.
Correction officer, somebody who works as a jailer, a corrections officer in a state prison. And so it looks like about a third of the states, I may be wrong about that, do decertify corrections as well. By the way, about 8 states don't decertify state police or state troopers, which seems crazy to me because if you're going to decertify a municipal police officer doing perjury, why wouldn't you want to do that for a state trooper as well?
Now and something I read that you had written, you talked about a guy who was at Abu Ghraib and was court-martialed for, and then he got fired.
So here's the story about all my work on decertification over the years has been involved at the state, local, and county level. But what is now apparent to me is that we need to have the same thing for federal corrections law enforcement officers. So Charles Grainer was a corrections officer in Pennsylvania and was accused of all kinds of misconduct with prisoners. Grainer then becomes an MP, goes to Abu Ghraib, and was court-martialed. You may remember some of the things he piled up bodies and do all those things. So what that tells me is we need to have the federal government have the similar certification and decertification. My understanding is a couple of federal departments and agencies are doing it. Department of Defense, or at least they have the authority to do it. National Park Service, they were involved in the riots control, if that's what you want to call it, in Lafayette Square. And I would think in particular, Border Patrol agents, because sexual offense is really rampant. And then if you do something bad as a federal officer and you try to go to the state, and vice versa, we would have it. Yeah.
Sexual offense rampant with border control?
I would think the Border Patrol agents definitely should be. They're not covered yet, as far as I
understand. My question was about sexual,
Yeah, sexual offense is a fairly common offense of women coming across the border. Because you'd assume that, who's going to believe me, this illegal alien or whatever.
They stopped us for having a banana about 2 years ago in our car that we forgot to declare. And we spent 2 hours at the Canadian-U.S. border.
Yeah, you were lucky.
A banana. I know. Well, so the reason that police departments hire officers with bad records would be money saving on training, unaware of priors, the record not being public. Now, what if someone resigned and they weren't fired?
Okay, so a lot of states, yes, a lot of states say if you resign in lieu of termination, that action can still become decertifiable. Furthermore, even if you stay on this force and you're committing consistent misconduct, you should be up for decertification. In other words, the fact you're fired shouldn't be necessary. Let's suppose you're just doing terrible things on the department and you're not fired, but the department, again, doesn't have much money. They can't afford to fire you because you're the so-called last chance agency. Nobody wants to come. Well, in that situation, you have to put pressure. This is the other thing that's important to your earlier question, what makes a good law? There has to be some kind of carrot or stick for that local chief or sheriff to report the decertifiable conduct, such as withdrawal of training funds. I think making it a crime is, no prosecutors can really prosecute that. The federal government, turning to that for a minute, has now been talking about not giving cops money. That's money for local cops, in various departments, unless you have a strong decertification law. And I was just suggesting what makes a strong law. It should be a broad swath of conduct that's covered. You should have more than just law enforcement, and you need to have some kind of enforcement so the chiefs and sheriffs will cooperate in the decertification process.
Okay. So turning to California, we're one of 5 states. The 5 states that don't have decertification laws cover about what percentage of the U.S. Police departments?
Well, California's huge. New Jersey's got an awful lot of them too. Massachusetts.
States.
Yeah. And Hawaii and Rhode Island. Hawaii's interesting. They're the only state that doesn't even have statewide training standards. Every state, including California, has that. They have a law, but for some reason, it's never been enforced.
So they don't have any statewide training?
No statewide training. It's up to each island department what to do. And I helped get that law passed, and for whatever reason, it's never been implemented.
Yeah, having lived in Hawaii for 8 years, what's interesting about Hawaii, it's actually a very centralized government. There's a state Department of Education. A lot of the departments are state-based, not county-based.
Yes, well, let me give you the example of why the law was passed. It was passed, the governor didn't sign it, he didn't veto it, so it went into effect. There was a state, whatever the name of the state agency that monitors the beach, there was the state person monitoring the beach, comes across a young woman who's smoking marijuana, and he says to her, I won't turn you in unless you give me money, give me marijuana, or let's have sex. He's then fired and then ends up working in Honolulu, or vice versa. It takes cases like that in my Sorbello roulette, Russian roulette, to get the motivation to do it. New Jersey recently had an officer that was featured in the New York Times who was fired by 9 different departments, continued to be hired. And that's the poster boy now for the New Jersey Attorney General, said, we've got to get licensing and decertification.
And that was the one just this past week that you were quoted when you were on the page 3 of the New York Times as the quote of the day?
Yeah, quote of the day, that's right. I didn't even know they had a quote.
What was your quote?
The quote of the day is, if we do it for cosmetologists, surely we should do it for police officers.
Yeah. Now, what about California? So we used to have decertification.
Actually, in California, it was called cancellation, was the same idea. But it was so limited, it was only if you've been convicted of a felony, which, by the way, is the California law anyway. So they've given up their power, their ability to cancel, but this new piece of legislation would overturn that. So, and one of the ironic things is that law was came into effect, and it repealed the old law, the limited law, because of pressure put on by the LA Police Protective Association on Gray Davis to appoint commissioners to the post who would say we should only be educational, we should not be regulatory. And now, law was repealed, as limited as it was.
That was repealed 2003?
2003, yeah, 2003. And now the LAPD Protective Association plus other unions have apparently said, we agree that we need to have decertification, because really when you think about it, do you really want to have a cop as your partner in the car who is a brutal person, who, sexual misconduct is such a common, I should mention that. There was an AP study a few years ago, 1,000 cops decertified for sexual misconduct, many of which involve minors and many of which involve victims of crime. That is a woman subject to domestic abuse. The officer comes to the house and says, I want to console you, let's have sex. Really unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. So it seems to, yeah, and maybe police departments are coming around, or police unions are coming around to realize if most of them feel like they're doing their job right, they don't want to have bad cops either. That's
absolutely right. I think the problem's been in the past that if you're a union president, it's hard for you have an upcoming primary to run for president. It's hard to say, I want more regulation, but it's inevitable. I mean, we're down to 5, and with the movement in all those states, I think ultimately all states will get some type of decertification. Again, the key is let's make it a strong enough law.
Right, because there's no point in having a weak one. So we had a police detective here in Santa Barbara who, a recent article just last week, they talked about she was fired in 2018, but people didn't realize it, for, I think, falsifying information or lying. So how do we know that she hasn't been hired someplace else? Or how would other departments know? I mean, it's great that they, internally did something. It's not so great that it was probably held secret. I mean, how much of this should be made? I guess one question is how much of this should be made public to the citizens in the community? And then what happens to someone like that who was fired for cause?
Okay, so another post-Ferguson improvement to these post-statutes, Illinois and Connecticut now say if you've been fired for certain, it may not necessarily be decertifiable, but for serious misconduct, at the post level, you have to send us that, and we have a list that we then share with other departments so that when they go to hire, they'll know that on the list. So I would call that decertification light. At least it lets other departments know. But in Connecticut goes one step further. If you have done something at that prior department that reaches this level of serious misconduct, then a new department can. So there are ways that the posts are getting not just decertification, but getting stronger provisions as well.
Right, and we should remind people again, post means police officer standard.
Training commission.
It's a commission that licenses or certifies and then decertifies police officers.
Right, and it does the training, it mandates training, it looks at the academies to make sure the training's there. It disqualifies for certain, like if you had bad conduct discharged from the Army, that would be another disqualifier. Minimum education standards. So there's training, there's basic training, in-service training, and then the decertification. Yeah.
Now, different states have different levels of training, but
huge difference.
Either.
And in fact, in some states, it used to be that if rural officers were not given the same amount of training as others, which is a problem because if you're an African American and you're touring, you're in a place where you needed 600 hours of training, but then you travel across the strait where they only meet 100 hours of training. You may not have, the officer who stops you may not have been trained on de-escalation and racial, implicit bias. So there is a trend now to make it uniform across the state. There's a lot of variation around the country, but within the state, at least my sense is it's starting to become uniform standards for training.
But state to state, the amount of training required varies.
That's right. State to state vary. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I read something. I have to find it, but I think that florists or something had more training than police officers in Louisiana. Maybe I don't know, got that right, but something like that. Yeah.
But Hap, when you mentioned the interstate movement, there is something called the National Decertification Index, which does track officers who've been decertified. There are about 30,000 officers who have been decertified, and that information then would be available if you left one state to go to another, that the local agency could find out about, or that state post could.
So there is a national, that's a national, like a database?
Yeah, but again, it's limited. It's only the fact that you've been decertified, and it's run by the post directors have an organization called IADLEST, and that group is the one that's running the data bank. There has been some push that over the years that Congress should take this on. There is a national practitioner database for healthcare professionals who are licensed, and you might say, if we do it for docs, why not for cops? That the feds maybe should get involved.
And then, so the national, let's move on to the national legislation. So there's a bill that was introduced in Congress, and I guess the Senate's also introducing to these covered decertification, licensing. Do they help fund the database? And how is the national legislation going to interact with what we've got state by state?
Well, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing that came out under Obama did recommend that the DOJ and this NDI kind of get together and cooperate. It hasn't happened yet, but the national legislation that's been proposed has suggested that the states put pressure, that the feds put pressure on the states by withholding funding, I mentioned earlier, if you don't have a strong decertification law. Not sure it's going to go anywhere, but at least it's out there.
Right. Well, it's hard to get the House and the Senate to agree on too much. So.
Right.
I don't think they even agree which way the sun comes up. What else? What have we missed? Right, we have a few minutes left. We talked about NDI. We talked about decertification. We talked about national legislation. why are police unions so powerful? I guess that's a question I would have. I mean, they
Yeah,
have.
well, but and they have traditionally been, as I say, those 5 states don't have it, very blue states, very strong police unions. But to me, the exciting thing is that finally, after George Floyd, and again, with that LAP Police Protective Association coming out in favor, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in California as this bill proceeds, to see where the unions are on this. I think they'll be coming around the table. They have to be consulted. And I don't think they're going to have this opposition because, again, my view is we do it for every other profession. Why should we not do it for policing profession, where, if anything, the power to arrest, use deadly force, search homes, should even be the higher priority to make sure we have a way to remove, not just for the safety of the community, but for the safety of other cops who are working with the person.
Right. That's true. I mean, the police officers who are out with a bad officer, they're in a pretty difficult situation. Do they confront the officer they're working with, or do they go along, or just, I mean, and then they're culpable too for
Yeah. Well, look at this guy Chauvin, and he was the trainer of
right.
these officers. So they're trying to say, hey, my boss, stop doing this. So that's a perfect example of what you're saying.
Now, the other thing you mentioned to me, and we've been talking before and over the years, is decertifying police departments. What is that possible? Does that ever happen? Why should that happen, or shouldn't?
My understanding that in Utah that there was a decertification, I don't know if it went through, of a police department. And the problem is that we have 18,000 departments in this country, way more than any other country. And what kind of management can you get with half of the departments 50% of departments in this country have 10 or fewer officers. What kind of management are you going to get from that? And many have one-person departments. So we have to think about, look, if we decertify, if you will, failing school districts, why shouldn't we do the same of failing police departments? We haven't gotten it yet. Camden, you may know, just completely dissolved and set it up again, but that was kind of on its own choice. I do predict that in the future, there will be this push to decertify really out of control departments, like the one I began talking today about, the Russian roulette place.
Okay, what have we missed? Anything?
No, I think we've covered it all. I think from my perspective, after 40 years looking back, I've been, pleasantly pleased that not only are states talking about getting those that don't have it, but those that have it that recognize. Recently, Michigan, Ohio, they've recognized Illinois that their current post statutes are way too weak, and so I'm hoping not only will the 5 that don't have it get it, but those that have weak laws will be strengthened.
There you go. That's a good place to end. Thank you very much, Roger. Nice to see you. And thanks for your good work. It's nice to have, it's a horrible situation that prompted more interest in this. But it's nice to have the opportunity to get more states to strengthen their laws. And I guess it's the good that's going to come out of the horrible killing in Minneapolis and other places. So thank you.
It's been my pleasure, Hap. Thank you.